Welcome, Alisa. So happy to have you here on our podcast called The Initial. My first question for you is actually to introduce yourself. So imagine we have never met. Where could I know you from potentially? Like which brands, etc. And what is the thing you're exceptionally good at in the experimentation space?
Okay, that's an amazing question. So first of all, my name is Alisa. Probably if you've heard about me, you've heard about me as a product manager of experimentation team in Preply, where I developed in-house experimentation platform. But also recently I moved to ADC Consulting. So now I'm on consultancy side, and now I'm helping airline companies to set up their experimentation programs. And talking about what I'm really good at, my expertise is mainly in building in-house solutions, but also I guess the big part of it is empowering people and the teams to use those solutions to the fullest potential. So that's where I focus most.
Yeah, you have a really unique experience and a great experience of building an experimentation, not only a program, but also a platform, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, super cool. And what is it about experimentation that makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, actually, I guess me entering experimentation world, it was a coincidence, but something I was really excited about because I'm coming from the data background. First year when I was working in data teams, I felt a bit of disconnect between data and product. And sometimes I would create a dashboard and then I wasn't sure who is using it, if people are using it, what kind of decision are they making using this dashboard. And experimentation for me is this beautiful like intersection of the data, but also the product and like where actual decision making is happening.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So you're actually a schooled data scientist? What's
Yeah,
your background? Yeah.
I started my career as a data scientist. I have background in applied mathematics as well. And first 5 years, like I was studying in parallel, I was working, and I was like a bit all over the place around the data. So I was data scientist, data analyst. I joined Bradley as data engineer in experimentation team first, and that's how experimentation entered my life. But yeah, the majority of my background is just turning data into value for the company.
And when you started at Preply, and maybe it's good to mention that Preply is correct me if I'm wrong, it's a tool where you can go as just a regular person to get educated or better in languages, is what I believe.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like online language learning platform. And what is special about that is that Preply connects students with a tutor and builds experience around it.
Yeah. And then that's where, did you start there as a data scientist?
I started as a data engineer, so I
Okay.
was mainly focusing on like data workflows, on speeding up the experimentation, introducing methods for variance reduction.
And where was that first meeting point of you and your data background with maybe the first A/B test you've ever seen or the first experiment?
Yeah, I think so. My team, experimentation team, was mainly responsible for setting the experimentation platform, not for implementing tests themselves. But I was coming and into previous companies before Preply, I was doing anti-fraud systems. Basically, it's building data science, machine learning algorithm to predict which transactions are going to be fraudulent and where you can potentially receive refunds and chargebacks, which is like hurting your business. And we didn't have it in Preply in the time I joined. So I thought it would be a nice decision to introduce it to the team and make it as an initiative on the side. And it was first experience for me of using the experimentation platform that we built. And I think it was also in many ways eye-opening because like building the platform, of course, you hear from users what are like the problems they're facing and so on. But you when you really go through the whole process and you meet, oh, I need so much time to evaluate this change. I don't have this metric that I need, and going through all the processes and meeting those problems from the side when, they're now blocking you to implement what you're working on, it really helps to, understand your users better. So yeah, if you're running an experimentation platform, really recommend you to set up even the simplest experiment just to feel and go like all the way in the shoes of the user.
So the first experiment you set up was at Preply.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And do you
think before,
remember what it was? What did you experiment with?
yeah. So that's what I said. Like the first that I set up myself, it was anti-fraud experiment.
Oh,
So
okay.
we
Yeah.
built basically a model to say, okay, this user or this transaction is a fraudulent one, meaning then we
Yeah.
will receive notification from the bank that please send us money back.
Yeah.
And we were trying to, detect which transaction are going to be fraudulent funds and basically block them.
Yeah. It sounds very useful for companies for sure.
It is. Honestly, I think it wasn't like the best choice in terms of it's quite a complex
Yeah,
experiment.
sounds
And
like.
now, if I would want to just learn how experimentation platform is working, I would go with a simpler one. But then, yeah, I was like, I know how to do it. I want to try it. But yeah, it was like a long process to make it working. And that's something that I like then as a team continue iterating on this one because we needed to go a long way to make this work.
And so Preply built their own experimentation engine and system in a way. Do you know at what point they started doing that? Because they could have chosen for a tool, right? So
Yeah,
what happened there?
I don't remember which year it was necessarily, but Preply started experimenting and building their tool pretty early on. I think the part of it is that, like what I mentioned to you, now Preply positions itself as like online language learning platform. So it's covering like all the process of learning. But in the earlier days, we thought of itself as a online marketplace. And we have like very famous examples of Booking, of Airbnb doing experimentation. And that's like a lot of contacts we have were with some people from Booking, from Airbnb, and leadership knew the idea of experimenting, and that was something they're really interested at. And I think that enabled engineers and other people to introduce the idea because they initially had this buy-in and interest from the leadership, and that's how experimentation happened to be. And of course, we just started. It was before I joined from history that I've learned. They just started with quite a simple library testing like some separate hypotheses, and bit by bit it evolved into like full system, full platform, and a specific team working on it.
And you said that actually from the start, higher management was very involved in Preply. Did that continue to stay that way?
Yeah, it did continue to stay this way. And I think I was like really happy to have this kind of management because I mentioned that I joined as a data engineer, but then I switched into product management and I became a product manager of experimentation platform. And I think it was my biggest blessing that I didn't need to like prove like not that I didn't need to prove the value of experimentation because of course we needed to prove how experimentation program is going and what our team specifically is contributing, but for the idea of experimentation, absolutely the majority of leadership team was very aligned that's the way we want to go because we want to measure whatever we're doing, we want to know how users are reacting to it, and yeah, we want to see the results and we want to act according to those results.
Yeah, makes total sense. And how did you then still prove the value of your work and also of the experimentation program while working there? How did you prove that to higher management?
Yeah, I think that's amazing question. And honestly, I spent a lot of time researching how do we measure the success of experimentation platform and experimentation team. So I love this question. For us, success of experimentation program was measured in the business metrics, such as revenue, such as gross margin, and other pretty general metrics. And those metrics as improvement from the product development during a year. So we would set up, some people call them groups, some people call them holdouts, but basically we would say, okay, some percent of users of the platform are not going to be affected by anything we do during the year. And then we compare their metrics to the metrics of other users if were affected by experiments, by us introducing new features, changing business model, like whatever is that what we are doing. And our final success metric, it would be how those two groups differ between each other. And of course, we would want to see the group we are actively experimenting on and deciding which features to roll out to have higher key business metrics. So that's like the core of experimentation program success.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And it sounds like something that a lot of companies actually struggle to do. So, how much percent of users, even a rough estimate is good, what would be in that holdout group?
It really depends on how you want to set up the holdout, like how many users you have, what kind of effects you're estimating there to be. We did it 1 year, like two main reasons. It was fast enough for us. We could detect the effects that we would totally typically get. At the same time, it was aligned just with our planning cycle. So it was the end of the year, and we would have those insights and we would inform the company about what we learned about the users, what kind of initiatives did we do, what worked, what didn't work. So it was both like mix of business decision just in a way to affect product planning in the best possible way in the right moment, but also what we could afford to ourselves to split, because the less users you have who are unaffected by experiments, the less, sorry, the more you need effect to detect it. So 50-50 is like the best one. We can detect the smallest changes, but if you want to detect, yeah, based on some small percentage of users, because of course you want people to see the results of your experimentation and you don't want to leave some users behind. So you would typically want to have as little users as possible, but there is some number that you can afford not having just like all insignificant results, which wouldn't be too actionable.
So, if I understand you correctly, you also let this control or holdout group run for a year, or was it more than a year?
No, for us, it was for a year, and then we would basically release all the users who were in control holdout group, and then we would shuffle them again and set up a new control holdout group for the new year. And it would consist of like other users who are unaffected.
And how do you then deal with, you start in January and then you find a win, and that the old version will stay in your holdout group, the new version will be implemented. But in the last month of the year, you might also find a win. So how do you deal with those effects? And you don't know how long the effect will stay, right? Did you just take that year, or did you do something to estimate the value and the revenue there?
Yeah, that's amazing question. So on the level of holdout, typically we wouldn't change much. So it was quite straightforward, and like year to year, we would just report the results as they are in holdout, knowing, of course, that you mentioned that some experiments are impacting the whole year. And for some experiments, we just decided to scale them. So of course, holdout control group won't be affected that much for them, but we had a little bit more complex system on what results do we expect to have versus what do we actually see in the holdout. And it would be something that we would regularly monitor, and we would be, okay, like we scale these experiments, we expect these experiments to bring, I know, X number of new users per day, and then we would aggregate it, adjust for false positive, some type error, and so on. And we would have, okay, we would expect the results of our holdout control group to be in some specific range. And if they're in the range, it's perfect. And if they're outside, it means that somewhere Maybe it was a novelty effect. So maybe it's just a false positive. Maybe it's some kind of bug or something else. But if we had big disconnect between what we would expect to see and what we are actually seeing, those are the cases where when we would go deeper and investigate what is happening there.
And at the end of the year, did you find a positive result for the holdout group? What happened?
That's a beautiful question. So we ran this holdout for, I don't remember, I guess already 5 years in a row.
Yeah.
And now we definitely see significantly positive results on key business metric, and it's pretty stable for the last years. But like a horror story that we kind of keep repeating of why we are investing in the holdouts, because for some people maybe it doesn't make that much sense because we are leaving some users behind, and you're like, oh, but I introduced better experience and those are users who are unaffected, just let me roll out to everyone. And there is like one story that we always share of kind of how experimentation began in Preply and why we're using the holdouts. And it's a story of the first year when basically we already had the experimentation platform set up, so we could set up the experiments, run it, make decision. We would have some recommendation on how to make decision, but ultimately product teams would decide by themselves what to do with experiment. And we went like this for a year, and in the end of the year, result was insignificant and to the negative side. And it was really surprising and like eye-opening. And we are like, okay, we invested so much effort in setting up the experimentation, in just like building the product. A lot of teams, like great teams, worked on making better user experience. Like what went wrong? And that's when we realized the danger of scaling kind of anything or scaling what you feel is right rather than what experimentation shows is right. And that's why it was important then for us to set up some decision making like rules and limitations and some additional checks to make sure we are not scaling something that can potentially harm our business, or even if we do that, we are very mindful about why we are doing it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, before there was an experimentation platform, the way you build it, was it true that teams would operate on their own, running their own experiments, and then choosing what would go live and what not?
Yeah, so for some time that I mentioned, like the first year, basically we had the system that already showed the result of experiments. So we would show you, okay, that's significant on metric X, insignificant on metric B or whatever. But then ultimately the team would decide, and I guess it's our human bias, if we invested a lot of efforts in something and then we see like, insignificant result, we tend to be like, oh, but it's not that bad. It's insignificant. It's not harming. I will push it. Like I will roll it out. But then if we roll out 10 insignificant experiments, we might as well see a pretty negative, like cumulative results out of them. And that's like a very dangerous area we wanted to avoid then.
So, in that case, creating the whole experimentation platform and I guess all the rules, because you've set rules in place, that brought everything together then in a way, all the
Yeah,
decision making.
yeah, it's brought the decision making together. Like we still had some exclusion, but we were like super mindful of them. Teams couldn't automatically scale anything which is like insignificant or negative, and they would need to bring it to the experimentation team, to leadership, and build the use case. Okay, if it's insignificant, but I don't know, it enables some iteration that we believe will be successful later, or if it's important because we need to comply with something or whatever. So if there is some kind of motivation, it's not that we never scaled them, but we became much more careful with them. and it's impossible just to scale like insignificant or negative experiments on your own because you decided to do so.
Wow, that's really interesting. And also how you brought everything together then as a team and experimentation program that, yeah, the experimentation program that you said. So I wanted to ask you, were all the teams in Preply, for example, already experimenting, or did you scale that at one point?
So the majority of the team were already experimenting when I started. I'm talking about product teams, so we were not involved in like finance, legal, and so on. So the majority of them were experimenting, and we only built like a lot of knowledge sessions, materials, ambassador program to make sure people really understand what experimentation is about and use it to their best. And also, one big change that we did is more a change about incentives of the teams and the way they build their targets because we are working with OKRs, and before OKRs were more like project based. I want to deliver some project, some experience, some feature. And with experimentation, we shifted to I want to shift this metric, I want to improve this metric, or I want to reduce this metric. And then teams have more flexibility on how exactly they achieve it. So they commit more to the improvement of metric, and then basically they try and experiment and see what works and what doesn't, but they're less attached to specific initiatives and more to the business goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as I understand now, you moved on from Preply and you're
Yeah,
now optimizing an experimentation program for an airline.
yeah.
How is that switch going and what's the difference there?
I am really excited because I feel that for me it's such an interesting opportunity to bring what I know to industry, which is not that familiar with it yet, or at least all the processes are not set up in the way they used to be. And I see so many like opportunities sparkling, and I'm like, oh, I can do that, I can connect that. But I guess for me, the biggest differences are first one, airlines, they have a lot of physical domains. So if in Preply it's like purely digital and we didn't really change anything physically, for airline, they have a lot of like route optimization, and it's like real routes. It's like where the plane will go, or like the fuel consumption, or how to paint the plane, or like how to load the baggage, how to optimize some processes which are happening like in the airport physically. So it's really interesting because it just covers so many different teams, and of course, like the teams which are not used to digital, that's additional challenge because like you need to make sure they have the relevant data, they collect it, and you can process. So like first step is just like to be onboarded and to unlock this part. And second, if in Preply we could randomize almost everything by user, then for air companies, it's quite hard, and a lot of experiments cannot be randomized by users. And then there are like big variety of algorithms that are being used. And honestly, when I joined, and like in Preply, we were mainly discussing, okay, A/B testing, Bayesian, ABC, like some pretty standard ones. And there I was like, oh, that's so many like new names of methods for me, because for them a lot of methods they just don't work and they still need to reduce the variance, because if you cannot split by user, typically you split but by something that is much less granular, and it makes your experimentation like first estimate like we would need to wait for a year, and then you really need to go deeper and investigate the methods. And sometimes my colleagues, I also see them like introducing new methods, writing the papers about two totally new methods that they designed. And it's really inspires me that it's kind of combination of like really clear business value, but also this like scientific part that's, yeah, just a lot of typical A/B testing programs are not completely sustainable for them just because it only covers like a small part of the use cases that they have.
So if you don't split by user, do I understand this correctly that in the airline company you're working for, they have found their own method to split users?
Yeah, so I can share you one method, which I guess ADC, we are publishing the paper about this one. And I asked the team that if I can share anything, it's like amazing example. So the example is about pricing, and typically you cannot split by users just because first you don't want to treat different people differently. Second, of course, not all the users are buying from your website or app. You just passing those prices to third-party services. So what do you do? And my team, they came up with a very smart design, which they call Switchback design. And basically, they are randomizing by combination of route and days till departure. So
Sorry, a combination of
the route, so like where
where
plane is coming
they're
from
coming
and where
from.
it goes
Okay.
to. So it's like, okay, Amsterdam, New
Mm-hmm.
York, Amsterdam, San Francisco, or
Yeah.
whatever. So it's the first dimension. And then also the second dimension. So it's the metrics, and then you randomize in the metrics. And the second dimension is days before departure. So you can be, okay, on even dates, I will see this price. And then on odd days, I will see another price, which is, I don't know, I think it's like really beautiful. And when they started to show me how it all works, and of course they wrote their own library, like creating those kind of metrics, doing the randomization, and yeah, and they wrote the article about it. And I don't remember what was the first setup, but I guess first they thought of randomizing only on routes, and it reduced the runtime for experiment by 80%, which is like crazy. And
Wow.
yeah, it's
So
such a
so
useful method.
this is the thing that makes me paranoid, probably, because if I am checking for a ticket to go somewhere, then it might be if your split is used, the switchback method, that one day I will see one price and the other day I will see another price for the same route.
I need to say the pricing in airlines is complicated. Like
Yeah.
it's a big topic, and like we are helping to measure, but also behind they have like teams which are focusing solely on pricing and kind of understanding the demand and supply and coming to a point where those two connect. So just to say it's a very complicated process, and I was of course interested for myself how to find those cheap tickets. But I guess the one very general and simple advice is just buy as far before as you can, because the supply is not that high. And when you are buying last date or last week, typically people are willing to pay more because it's urgent for them. And then you will end up paying more because supply is higher. Sorry, demand is higher. So supply will adjust and prices will go higher as well.
Okay, so I know you love traveling, so
Yeah.
I understand that you now have the strategy of planning far ahead your
Yes,
travels.
I
Yeah.
am trying.
You're trying. Okay. No, that's good. I wanted to come back to that holdout test because
Of course.
that was really fascinating to me, and I wanted to ask you, are insignificant tests actually more dangerous than we might think?
I do think that they are quite dangerous, especially as they come up together. So it's one thing if once in a year you have a significant test, and this test will enable like further iteration, and you like really sure that in the end, for example, you have one insignificant test, but then you have two significants on top, and you're pretty sure they're covering this insignificance. That's a good case. And a bad case is when like scaling insignificant tests becomes almost like a default because you're like, oh, but it's not hurting. Like they are insignificant because we don't know if they are hurting or improving the user experience. And they might as well hurt. And especially when we are scaling not one, 10 or more insignificant experiments together, of course, yeah, they can absolutely harm the business metrics and you should be careful with them.
Yeah, thanks so much for that advice. And what do you think? Is experimentation only for tech giants? Do you need to be a certain type of company, or is it really for everyone?
I think I like the term experimentation, but also I love the term measurement as well. And for me, it's core principle behind experimentation. You want to understand the returns of your investments. And I think that experimentation is indeed for everyone, and it's not only about tech. No, now I'm working with airlines, and they have a lot of aspects of a lot of teams that are not working directly online, but they're working somewhere in operation, like behind the skill in offline world. So definitely experimentation is for offline as well. And just to share a couple of examples, I remember like Netflix is one of the companies which is like very famous for experimentation. And so I was like checking the history of experimentation in Netflix, and I found one article where they were sharing that experimentation started. I guess they were not even online platform yet. They were like renting out DVD discs, and they handed flyers to people on streets, and they just have two kinds of flyers with two kinds of promotion. I don't remember what they were, but for example, it could be minus 10% on the first buy, or two with some discounts. But they were doing it like printing different types of flyers and handing different flyers to people just walking past the person who is given to them. And then the people would come to the shop with a flyer, and then they would analyze with what kind of flyers are they coming more often. And for me, it's like such a simple example, but such a beautiful one. Like you don't need to be tech, you don't need to be giant. Experimentation is how you make smarter decision, and it's ultimately how you become giant rather than something that only comes when you already have like millions of users.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that example. Are you running any offline tests at this moment, or you're still really focusing on online?
Now we do. Again, I'm helping more with building the platform and like team to adapt it. So I'm not the one standing close to airplane and telling what to do, but absolutely, yeah, we do quite a lot of offline experiments. Yes.
Really amazing. Is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you think is important to talk about?
I think just two smaller things that I wanted to share, but common mistakes or like pitfalls
Yeah.
that I see is first one, not focusing enough on the impact, like what I told you about the holdout as ultimate impact measurement tool. But of course, it's not the only one, and sometimes you cannot afford to set up the holdout. But still, I think we should be focusing on the impact, not just on number of experiments or like succeed rate. We should be focusing on impact. That's what we should care about because we are building experimentation platform, at least, you know, me as person building them in-house. We are not building them to be a company with the best experimentation platform. We are building them to help the company become the best company. So for me, it's very important to focus on like the whole life cycle, not only how do we build the platform, but how we make sure people interact with it in the right way and we see the results that we expected. And the second one I wanted to share also is about how we focus and we tend to focus on the positive side, right? What are the winners? What are the successful experiments? But I think a big value of experimentation program is actually to find what is not working and not to roll it out and protect your user from new feature or experience which would potentially be harmful. So for me, as much as for finding winners, it's really important to understand what is not working, and it's also like a big goal behind experimentation platform.
Amazing. Thanks so much for sharing those two common pitfalls. I think they're really important. And Alisa, our time for now is up, but you were a lovely guest for our show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.